Did one injury just create one of the most unexpected fights in UFC history? Because what looked like a routine UFC 328 pullout may have triggered something much bigger. A fighter withdraws due to injury. Normally, that's where the story ends. But this time, it may be where a completely different story begins. Because almost immediately, speculation started building around a shocking possibility. Could the chaos surrounding UFC 328 have opened the door for Islam Makhachev versus Garry? At first, it sounds unlikely, maybe even ridiculous. A dominant lightweight champion linked to a dangerous welterweight contender? That doesn't happen. Or does it? Because once you look at the timing, the matchmaking pressure, the division politics, and the UFC's history of making massive fights when plans fall apart, this starts looking less like a rumor and more like a real possibility. And if that's true, this injury may have done more than remove one fighter from UFC 328. It may have reshaped the future of two divisions. In this video, we're breaking down what actually happened with the UFC 328 pullout. Why people are suddenly talking about Makhachev versus Garry. Whether this fight makes any real sense, and why the UFC could have far more to gain from this matchup than fans realize. Because if this fight is being quietly positioned behind the scenes, the signs may already be there, and most people are missing them. So did one injury accidentally set up one of the wildest matchups the UFC could make? Let's break it down. The first thing that made this rumor impossible to ignore wasn't the injury itself. Fighters pull out all the time. Cards change. Opponents get replaced. Fans complain, the UFC adjusts, and the machine keeps moving. That's normal. What wasn't normal was how quickly the conversation shifted from who replaces the injured fighter to why are people suddenly talking about Islam Makhachev and Garry? That shift matters because rumors in MMA usually start in predictable places: anonymous posts, fan theories, clickbait headlines. But this felt different because it didn't begin with one big claim. It built through fragments. A comment here, a reaction there, a passing mention in fight circles, people connecting dots that maybe weren't meant to be connected. And once people started looking closer, the timing started to look suspicious. The UFC 328 disruption created a problem. Main cards are built around momentum, contracts, broadcast expectations, and marketable storylines. When a major fight falls apart, the promotion doesn't just lose a matchup, it risks losing a narrative, and the UFC hates empty space. When there's a vacuum, they usually fill it fast. That's where the speculation began. Because at the exact moment fans were asking what the UFC might do next, talk surfaced about possible backup plans, emergency options, and creative solutions. Nothing official. Nothing confirmed, but enough to make people wonder whether a bigger conversation was happening behind closed doors. And once the name of Islam Makhachev entered that conversation, everything changed. Because Makhachev isn't the kind of fighter casually thrown into rumors. His moves matter, his schedule matters, his division matters. When his name starts circulating around unexpected matchups, people pay attention. Then there's Garry, a fighter who has built a reputation around calling for massive opportunities, a fighter who has made it clear he sees himself in elite conversations, and maybe more importantly, a fighter the UFC could potentially view as a risk worth taking if the reward is big enough. That's where this starts getting interesting, because on paper, Makhachev versus Garry sounds strange. Different weight class dynamics. Different trajectories, different immediate priorities, but strange fights happen when circumstances force them. And injuries force circumstances. The people dismissing this rumor often focus on why the matchup makes no sense. But in MMA, some of the biggest fights ever made looked like they made no sense, until suddenly they were signed. That's why some insiders, or at least people claiming to understand how the UFC thinks, started pointing toward a different question. Not, would the UFC normally book this? But, would the UFC consider it if they needed a major solution fast? That is a very different question. Because if the injury at UFC 328 created pressure, if schedules unexpectedly aligned, if one side needed a short notice opportunity, if another side wanted leverage in negotiations, then what seemed absurd starts becoming something else, something possible. And there's another layer people keep ignoring: leverage. In modern UFC matchmaking, our rumored fights don't always exist because the promotion wants to book them. Sometimes they exist because someone wants the rumor itself to exist. A rumor can test fan reaction. A rumor can pressure another contender. A rumor can strengthen contract discussions. A rumor can send a message to an entire division. And if that's happening here, then the Makhachev Garry talk may not be accidental at all. Some fans even started pointing to the UFC's history of floating ideas before formal announcements. Not always publicly, not always directly, but enough that when unusual fight talk starts spreading, people don't dismiss it the way they used to. Because sometimes rumors are nonsense, and sometimes rumors are the smoke before the fire. Now look at the competitive angle. What would Garry gain? Everything. The biggest opportunity of his career. The kind of fight that changes a fighter's status overnight. The kind of fight you do not say no to. And what would Makhachev gain? That depends on how you look at it. Risk? Absolutely. But also a chance to disrupt expectations. A chance to chase something bigger than routine title defenses. A chance to do something people would spend months debating. And if there is one thing the UFC understands, it is debate. Debate sells, confusion sells, controversy sells, and a fight people argue about before it's even announced, that sells better than most, which is why some fans think the real story isn't the injury. The real story is what the injury may have allowed people to quietly explore. Because according to one theory spreading in MMA circles, the pullout didn't create this idea. It exposed an idea that may have already existed. Well, and if that's true, then the biggest question isn't whether Makhachev versus Garry is realistic. It's whether UFC 328 accidentally revealed a fight the public was never supposed to be discussing this early. If that sounds far-fetched, consider what usually happens when a rumor refuses to die. Most false rumors collapse quickly. They burn hot for a few hours, then disappear when nobody credible gives them oxygen. But this one kept resurfacing, and not because anyone officially confirmed it. It kept resurfacing because too many details, real or perceived, seemed to keep feeding it. One of the biggest reasons was timing around activity. Fans started noticing how quickly people began speculating about possible next moves instead of focusing on the injured fighter. That was unusual, and normally the immediate story is replacement options tied to the same division. This time, the conversation drifted outward. It started touching bigger names, bigger scenarios, and much riskier possibilities. That's when some observers began looking at the possibility that this was not a spontaneous rumor, but a controlled leak. And in MMA, the idea of controlled leaks is not exactly fantasy. Fight promotions test reactions all the time. Managers float ideas. Media personalities hear something half-formed and hint at it without fully reporting it. Fighters themselves sometimes drop vague comments that mean everything or nothing. And if even one person connected to negotiations wanted to gauge how fans would react to Makhachev versus Garry, this is exactly what it might look like. No official announcement, no direct confirmation, just enough smoke to make people ask questions. Then another detail made the theory even harder to dismiss. Stylistically, the fight is bizarre, which is exactly why some people think it might appeal to the UFC. Think about it. A dominant champion known for suffocating control, a dangerous contender known for confidence, movement, and unpredictability. That contrast creates a story before a punch is thrown. And the UFC loves fights that market themselves. Some fans even pointed to a pattern. Whenever the promotion faces disruption, it sometimes doesn't just repair the original plan. It upgrades the chaos. It turns crisis into spectacle. And if a major card suddenly needed a jolt, what would generate more conversation? A routine replacement fight? Or a matchup so unexpected the entire MMA world debates whether it makes any sense? And that is where the theory started becoming more detailed. Some believed Garry's name wasn't being mentioned because a fight was close. They believed his name was being mentioned because he may have been discussed as an option. And in fight business, being discussed as an option can be the first stage of something much bigger, because even rejected ideas tell you what people are thinking. And if people inside the sport even entertained this matchup for 5 minutes, that alone changes how seriously the rumor should be taken. Then there's the political angle inside the divisions. This is where things get messy. Because a fight like this doesn't just affect two athletes. It affects contenders waiting for title opportunities. It affects rankings. It affects champions in neighboring divisions. It affects negotiations nobody outside the room can see, which is exactly why some fans believe the rumor triggered tension. Not public tension, private tension, the kind that shows up as silence. And silence, in combat sports, often makes people more suspicious than statements do. Because, when a rumor is completely absurd, people often laugh it off. When nobody rushes to kill the rumor, people start wondering why. Now, none of this proves the fight was being planned, but that's what makes this so compelling. Nothing is concrete. Everything is circumstantial, and yet the pieces keep inviting interpretation. For example, why did so many discussions move so quickly from replacement talk to superfight talk? Why did fans immediately treat the rumor as something worth analyzing instead of dismissing? Why did the theory survive longer than most fabricated matchmaking noise? Those are not proof, but they are reasons people keep looking closer. And then came the boldest theory of all, that the injury at UFC 328 may not have triggered the rumor by accident. It may have created cover for discussing options that were already being explored. That changes everything. Because if that theory holds even a little truth, then the public may be treating this as wild speculation, while insiders may be treating it as one of several scenarios on the table. And if that sounds impossible, remember, many of the biggest shocks in MMA looked impossible until the contracts were signed. That is why this rumor keeps pulling people in. It sits in that dangerous zone between implausible and believable, too strange to accept easily, too detailed to dismiss comfortably. And maybe that is why fans are split right down the middle. One side sees obvious clickbait. The other sees signals hiding in plain sight. But what if both sides are missing something? What if the real question is not whether Makhachev versus Garry was close to happening, but whether the UFC wanted people talking about it, even if the fight itself was never imminent? Because if the rumor generated pressure, shifted leverage, or distracted attention from something else happening behind the scenes, then the rumor may have done its job whether the fight happens or not. And if that is true, then maybe the strangest possibility is not that this matchup was leaked. Maybe the strangest possibility is that the leak itself was the strategy. If the leak was the strategy, then the next question becomes even more controversial. Who benefits? Because every rumor that survives this long usually survives because it serves someone. And once people started asking who benefits from Makhachev versus Garry speculation, the theories became much harder to ignore. Some believed the obvious answer was the UFC. A surprise matchup like this creates instant attention. It dominates headlines. It hijacks conversations across divisions. And perhaps most importantly, it changes what fans are arguing about. Instead of debating why a fighter pulled out of UFC 328, fans begin debating whether a much bigger fight is secretly being built. That shifts the narrative, and controlling the narrative has always mattered. But others believe the bigger beneficiary could be the fighters themselves. Because rumors can function as negotiation tools. Imagine a scenario where Makhachev's side wants leverage for future opportunities. Even indirect speculation linking his name to an unusual super fight increases attention around his options. It expands the conversation beyond routine matchmaking. That has value. Then there's Garry. For Garry, even being mentioned in hypothetical discussions with a fighter of Makhachev's stature elevates perception. It changes how fans and perhaps even decision-makers view his position. Sometimes in fight business, perception moves before contracts do. And once perception moves, real opportunities can follow. That idea made some fans revisit something else: the silence from the people who normally shut down absurd rumors. Now think about how often obviously false matchmaking stories get rejected almost immediately. A manager denies it. A fighter mocks it. A reporter kills it. Something usually happens. But with this, what happened was ambiguity. And ambiguity is dangerous, because ambiguity invites interpretation. Some took that silence as proof there was nothing real. Others took the same silence as evidence nobody wanted to reveal too much. Same facts, completely opposite conclusions. That is how theories grow. Then another layer emerged: scheduling. And this is where even skeptics started paying attention. Because if the injury at UFC 328 disrupted more than one timeline, if it affected multiple camps, if it forced conversations about contingency plans, then a fight nobody expected might have at least entered discussion as a fallback. And again, not as a done deal, as an option. And options matter, because many famous fights began as backup ideas. People forget that. Some matchups were never plan A. They became reality only because something else collapsed, which makes one question impossible to ignore. Was Makhachev versus Garry a wild rumor? Or was it a backup scenario that somehow escaped into public speculation? Those are very different things. And the more people considered that possibility, the stranger certain details started to look. Some fans pointed to the way rumors around the matchup seemed oddly persistent without becoming clearer. That is unusual. False rumors often become ridiculous fast. Real negotiations often become clearer over time. But this stayed in between: foggy, persistent, unresolved. And almost as if nobody wanted it confirmed. But nobody wanted it fully dead either. That middle ground is where the comment wars started. Because once people suspect something is being half hidden, every detail starts feeling suspicious. A vague interview answer, an offhand remark, a fighter refusing to dismiss a hypothetical. Even normal behavior starts looking coded. And whether that interpretation is rational or not almost stops mattering. Because once fans believe there may be something behind the curtain, they start looking for signals everywhere. Then came the theory that pushed this into something even bigger: that the rumor may not have been about UFC 328 alone. That it may have been tied to longer-term plans. Future cards, future leverage, future divisional movement. If that sounds speculative, that is because it is. But speculation becomes powerful when enough people can imagine how it might be true. And many could, because suddenly the fight was no longer being discussed as a bizarre one-off. It was being discussed as a possible piece in a much larger board. And once you frame it that way, the idea stops sounding random. It starts sounding strategic. Maybe risky, maybe unlikely, but strategic. Of course, there is another possibility, that all of this is overanalysis. that fans connected unrelated dots, that the UFC 328 injury caused chaos, and chaos created fantasy matchmaking. Nothing more. That is entirely possible. Maybe this entire rumor was built from coincidence. Maybe no serious talks ever existed. Maybe Makhachev versus Garry was never anything beyond internet noise. But here is the problem with that explanation. It does not explain why the rumor has kept surviving every opportunity to disappear. And that is what keeps dragging people back. Because unresolved stories are irresistible, especially in a sport built on uncertainty, especially when the central question still has no clean answer. Was the injury merely an injury? Or did it expose conversations fans were never supposed to notice? Was the leak accidental or intentional? Was the fight unrealistic from the start, or quietly explored just enough to leave fingerprints? Those questions remain, and until someone definitively answers them, the rumor lives. Maybe as fiction, maybe as half-truth, maybe as something much closer to reality than people are comfortable admitting. And if even one person involved eventually reveals that the matchup was discussed behind closed doors, even briefly, then everything people dismissed as conspiracy suddenly looks very different. If everything people dismissed as conspiracy could one day look different, then there is one final layer that makes this rumor even harder to shake. What if the most important clue was never the injury and never the leak, but the reaction after the leak? Because reactions reveal pressure, and pressure reveals where the real story may be hiding. Look at what happened the moment this speculation started spreading. Fans split instantly. Some laughed, some analyzed, some treated it like obvious fiction. Others started comparing timelines, styles, and incentives as if they were piecing together something real. That level of division is unusual unless a rumor touches a nerve. And this touched several. It touched title politics. It touched fighter leverage. It touched the possibility that the UFC may be far more flexible in chaos than it appears publicly. And once people started thinking in those terms, the injury itself almost became secondary. The bigger question became whether the pullout triggered movement nobody outside the negotiation rooms was supposed to detect. That is where one of the most controversial theories emerged. That after the rumor spread, the real objective was not to confirm it, but to watch the reaction. Think about how valuable that would be. You float nothing official. You commit to nothing. But suddenly millions of fans are effectively giving you free market research. Would people hate the fight? Would they buy into it? Would they treat it as absurd or fascinating? Those answers matter. And if the response was stronger than expected, why wouldn't the UFC at least keep the idea alive internally? That theory may sound too calculated, but fight promotions are built on calculated reactions. Every major announcement is shaped by anticipated response. Why would unofficial ideas be any different? Then there is something even more interesting. The fighters themselves. Because some observers believe the most revealing thing was not what was said publicly, but what was not said. No forceful shutdown, no universal ridicule, no clean, "this is nonsense." Just enough ambiguity to keep debate alive. And again, maybe that means nothing, or maybe ambiguity was the safest response because certainty would have exposed too much. That is why this rumor refuses to behave like ordinary clickbait. Ordinary clickbait burns out. This keeps mutating. Every attempt to dismiss it creates a new theory. Every theory creates new debate, and every debate makes people revisit whether there was something real at the center all along. Then there is the possibility nobody talks about enough. What if the rumored matchup was discussed, but not for the reason fans assume? Not as an immediate fight, not as a secret UFC 328 replacement, but as a contingency linked to a larger negotiation involving future title paths. That would explain a lot. It would explain why whispers emerged without clarity. It would explain why nothing materialized publicly. It would explain why the rumor feels too structured to be random, but too incomplete to be a genuine leak. Because maybe it was neither. Maybe it was a fragment of a much bigger conversation. And fragments are dangerous, because fragments create speculation more powerful than facts, especially when the missing pieces are hidden. That possibility led some fans to revisit one uncomfortable idea: that the UFC may sometimes allow selective confusion because confusion can be useful. Useful for leverage, useful for negotiation, useful for shifting attention while other deals move quietly. If that sounds cynical, maybe it is. But in a sport where announcements collapse overnight and impossible fights become real with one press conference, cynicism and realism often look very similar. Now consider the scenario no one can disprove. The injury happens. Contingency discussions begin. Several unconventional names are floated internally. One of those names is Garry. May someone close enough to hear fragments mentions it. The idea spreads before it matures. Public debate erupts, the UFC watches, the fighters take notice, and suddenly a scenario that began as internal brainstorming becomes public mythology. Is that what happened? Nobody outside a small circle can say for certain. But can anyone prove it did not happen? That is where the argument lives. Because the story survives in the gap between what cannot be confirmed and what cannot be ruled out. And that gap is where the most explosive MMA rumors usually live. Maybe years from now, someone casually reveals in an interview that Makhachev versus Garry was briefly discussed when UFC 328 fell apart. If that happens, people will claim they knew all along. But if that never happens, skeptics will say this was fantasy from the start. Until then, both sides have something to hold on to. And maybe that is why this rumor may be more powerful unresolved than resolved. Because once something is confirmed, debate ends. Once something is denied completely, debate fades. But uncertainty keeps stories alive. And this story is still alive. Not because anyone proved the fight was close, but because too many strange elements make people wonder whether it was closer than anyone wants to admit. So maybe the real mystery was never whether the UFC 328 Pullout set up Makhachev versus Garry. Maybe the real mystery is whether fans accidentally saw the outline of a fight the sport was not ready to reveal. So now I want to know what you think. Was this entire Makhachev versus Garry rumor just classic MMA chaos? Fans connecting random dots after a UFC 328 injury? Or did that pullout accidentally expose real behind-the-scenes discussions the public was never supposed to hear about? Because honestly, there are arguments both ways. Maybe this was nothing more than speculation fueled by timing, confusion, and internet hype. Or maybe, just maybe, this was one of those rare moments where a rumor leaked before the UFC was ready to move. And if that's true, then the biggest question is not whether this fight happens. It's whether it was quietly considered at all. I want you in the comments to tell me where you stand. Was Makhachev versus Garry ever a real possibility? Was this a strategic leak, or is this complete nonsense people have overanalyzed? And be honest. If the UFC announced this fight tomorrow, would you be shocked? Or would you say you saw it coming? Drop your take below. It's because I have a feeling the comments on this one are going to be a war. And if you enjoyed deep dive breakdowns like this, where we separate rumors, strategy, and what might really be happening behind the scenes, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the next story we're covering might be even crazier than this one.